Please, John.
I think actually what I'll do is, in the first instance, is just pick up some of Jero's observations about this issue of using self-reports, which I think has come up in some of the previous discussions and has come up in this panel. And kind of the tenor of this discussion has been that, in a sense, we think self-reports of measures of resilience capacity might be valuable, but we're worried that they're subject to all sorts of biases. And one thing that's useful to bear in mind on this is that sometimes actually understanding those biases actually can be informative in its own right. Since it's Friday night, it's almost time to get a drink, so we can start with storytelling. I'd probably sort of relate an example of this, which is not from work on resilience, but it's some of the work I've done on poverty. As some of you will know, there is a literature within the literature on the measurement of poverty on the use of self-reports as opposed to, in some sense, objective measures using income or expenditure. And it goes like this, is that we were doing survey work here in Ethiopia, and we asked people to put them on a self-reported poverty scale, from being very rich down to destitute. And then we also said, well, we now want you to think about your circumstances 10 years ago and put yourself on the same scale. And then comparing these two scales, it was unambiguous, okay, across the entire population, that in fact that people were now worse off than they were 10 years ago. Okay? It wasn't true for everybody, but it was true for a lot of people. What made this particularly interesting is this was actually part of a longitudinal survey where we were going back to interview the same households. And in fact, we knew two things. First of all, we had interviewed exactly the same households 10 years ago. And we had at that time, and in this survey, we had picked up a whole series of markers of material well-being. All of those markers had shown significant improvement over time. Other markers, such as income, consumption, children's schooling, everything was better than what it was. But also, in that earlier survey 10 years ago, we had also asked people to put themselves on exactly the same scale. And what was interesting is you looked at what people had reported 10 years ago, as opposed to what they were reporting in terms of recall. In effect, people were being nostalgic. Mm-hmm. They were saying, oh, things were so much better off in the old days. But in particular, the nostalgia was correlated with some particular household characteristics. In general, people were less likely to be nostalgic if their income had been growing over time. But they were more likely to be nostalgic if their income was growing more slowly than that as the village as a whole. In other words, what we were getting out of this, in some sense, what would seemingly be biases in self-reports, was actually very real information. That in fact, that people who felt themselves were becoming poorer were not so much necessarily becoming poorer in a material sense, but they felt they were falling behind other people in the village. All of which is to say is that when we talk about perceptual data, the fact that there are biases in these data, or that there can be biases in these data, actually in itself can be informative. And with that, I guess I now actually have to answer the questions I was asked. So let me do that as well very briefly. Someone said, well, what are the sorts of ways in which we can use these indices of resilience capacity? In principle, we could use them as a diagnostic. We could use them to inform planning or perhaps intervention design. We possibly could use them for targeting. We could use them for monitoring. We could use them for evaluation. But in my view is that any of these uses, I think, should be done really with an enormous amount of caution and arguably humility. Where I think at a particular stage of measurement on this, where in fact it would be very unwise to be making very strong statements based on what we know about how to measure these capacities. And it's important to keep that in mind because I suspect there are many people in this room who at various points in time have come under pressure, they're seniors, to actually come up with a number. I know that some of us working at IFPRI about a year or so ago, we met a senior person from the World Bank.
I'm old, am I not senior?
No, I attempted to say Gerald on the grounds he might not remember, but in fact it was somebody else completely. And he was very clear. He said, I want you to give me an index of resilience. Because what I want to be able to do is in a year from now, I want to be able to say that my project's resilience has increased by 20%, and my projects have done a much better job than another manager in this unit. So,
I apologize for my colleague.
so you all noticed that as a well-practiced apology on Jerem's part. But I think, as I say, there's a very real danger that in some sense, once you create a number, that in a sense that number calcifies, and that it takes on a life of its own, which it isn't always justified. And as we talk about these numbers, I think also takes us to this question about what is this level of aggregation over which, in fact, we should measure resilience. I think one thing which has come out of the conversations that various people have had is that it's not clear that you just want to measure resilience at one particular level. That there are so many interdependencies across levels, from individuals to households to communities, and the point about how communities are defined, I think, was a very well made observation. And so in some sense, we need to actually make progress on all of these. Actually strengthen individuals and actually make them stronger in the face of shocks or stressors that they might face subsequently. So a further challenge, on top of all the other challenges we've been discussing in terms of measurement, is actually to understand when in fact some of these shocks or stressors, although they might actually create some discomfort or may in fact create welfare loss in the short term, may have some longer term beneficial consequences, and when in fact these shocks or stressors are actually damaging.
There was John, there was a question. Oh, sorry. You want to add something on this?
I had some reaction. I don't know if it's pertinent at this point or not, but on this, on whether or not we should be worried about not having objective measures of shocks. I think there is a very good reason why we should have, which is that in a number of cases, having an objective measure of shocks is key to trigger responses from either the public sector or the private sector. Think about all discussion about index-based insurance. If you think about what the ARC is doing in Africa, the Africa Risk Capacity, which is essentially developing a sovereign risk pool based on objective measure of shocks, then you can get away from that. And so that's why it's so important, I think, to work further on developing a better understanding of the response at the community and household level to shocks that can be objectively measured.
Okay. Raffaello Cervigni from the World Bank.
Can I follow up on that? Raffaello?
Yeah.
I think even I had it written here. The fact I wrote insurance don't use self-reported measurement, so, which is true. But at the same time, farmers have a hard time using the objective measurement that we have at our disposal. And one of the main reason probably for low pickup of like a weather insurance, index weather insurance, is like the farmer don't have a connection to a number that comes from weather station that might not be working, or like you just say, it might be 50 miles away. So I think that the question is like, I agree with you, like you just said, like you do need for certain purposes, for certain like a more direct objective measurement, but. Again, it's more about to me how we can validate some of the easier to scale measurement using more accurate and direct and costly measure in the way that you can then scale up. But again, obviously depends on data. Insurance will never use a self-report measurement for that particular purpose. Clearly not a way to go. But there are many other purposes for which validating proper measurement, self-reported measurement, I think will go a long way in terms of scaling up. Yeah.
We can't just forget that there is a need for objective.
Yeah.
Okay, now we have about 12 minutes, and out of which the last, not 5, but 6 minutes are reserved for final comments from the panelists. You have 5, but I think that Mark, as a chair of the technical working group, should say something else, some take-home messages that you have taken out of this discussion. So we have about 5-6 minutes. Any comments, additional comments on the questions that were raised? Otherwise, we'll take maybe a couple of more questions. There is one hand.
Thank you. Lawrence Haddad here. Thanks, panel. Great set of quips, good jokes, good banter. Well done. Really good.
Nothing else.
I want you to get dark. I want you to tell us about your deepest, darkest worries. related to resilience, of course. I want here's the story. We're interested in building resilience because we think communities, especially poor communities and poor countries and regions, are exposed to greater uncertainty, greater irreversibilities, more threshold effects, you name it, more shocks. And we think they're less able to cope and adapt and absorb and move away from those than better off communities. So we're worried about that. We're thinking about what can we do in public policy and as practitioners to build resilience or facilitate that process. So the first step is to measure it, right? Try to measure some of it. Second step is to try to identify some of the drivers. Someone mentioned that earlier. Third step is to see whether any of those drivers are at all amenable to any kind of external or internal public action. Then once you've done that, are policymakers or practitioners actually going to be able to understand, and is it going to be too complicated for them to actually respond to? And then finally, are they actually even going to be interested in this? Because ultimately, they don't feel these shocks. They don't feel, they're very resilient. They're driving around in big cars and live in nice places, and they have health insurance and all that sort of stuff. They don't have to deal with any of this stuff. Which of those bits of the story are you most worried about? And you can't say all.
Okay, before you answer to this question, I'm not sure who else answered to this question. Christophe Benet, I think he's also a member of the technical working group. He wanted to raise a point.
It's not necessarily a question, though. It's maybe a comment for fellows, researchers, and practitioners that are currently implementing resilience intervention. I think we would all agree on the assumption, which is that social cohesion is probably a very important positive factors in terms of resilience. I will not ask who will dare putting his hands up against that hypothesis. Well, actually, I'm giving you a story where it makes us think twice. Mm-hmm. It's two comparative analysis of Lagan, fishing communities living on Lagan. One has a very, very strong social cohesion to the point that they have managed to keep their traditional management system up to now. And the other one was kind of very weak in terms of social cohesion, and there was no local traditional management system anymore. But those Lagan fisheries are under such pressure now that the communities which the very strong social cohesion have been actually keeping on sticking to that traditional management system to the point that they refused kind of evolving and transforming. While the other communities that was more weak in terms of social cohesion had actually no choice but actually to get on and actually give up fisheries. At the end of the day, the very strongly social cohesion communities is actually dying now. So my question is, when we assume that social cohesion is a positive effect or has a positive effect, we are already having a very strong and biased analysis of resilience. Actually, social cohesion norms actually are sometimes working against transformation or adaptation. So I just would like you to keep that in mind when you adapt or you plan for your intervention.
Can I make a comment on Chris's comment? I mean, we talked about the social, the bridging, bonding, and linking networking, and so I think to look at cohesion without looking at those other dimensions is part of the problem, because I'm suspecting that those communities that had weak cohesion may have had better linking or bridging. So, I mean, I think you have to look at all of those to really get a good sense of the relationship with longer-term resilience.